She could not answer a single question. Not one. Not the first question the VP asked, which was straightforward and technical, and the kind of thing that anyone who had genuinely produced the work would answer in under 30 seconds. Not the third question, which required slightly deeper knowledge of the methodology. Not the seventh question, which was the one I had been waiting for, the specific question about the approach to the secondary data set that only the person who had spent 6 weeks developing that approach could answer with any accuracy. 7 questions. Silence or deflection on every one. I sat at the end of the conference table and I did not say anything. I did not look at my manager Cressida with satisfaction, or with the visible relief of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 2 years. I looked at the table in front of me the way I looked at all things that required me to manage my expression, with the steady, neutral attention of someone who is present and composed and has decided that the room will reach its own conclusions without any assistance from her. The VP, whose name was Darian, looked at Cressida for a long moment after the 7th question produced nothing usable. Then he looked at me. He said, "V, walk me through the secondary data approach." I said, "Of course." And I did. My name is V. Ocone. I had been doing Cressida's job for 2 years while she put her name on it. And the Tuesday afternoon in that conference room was the day that arrangement ended. I need to tell you who Cressida was so the 2 years make sense. She was 44. She had been a senior manager at Callaway Research for 11 years, and had built a reputation over that time for producing work the firm's leadership considered reliable and thorough. She was confident in the boardroom and skilled at the specific politics of a mid-sized research firm, the management of relationships with senior leadership, the navigation of competing priorities, the presentation of work in terms that landed well regardless of who was in the room. What she was less skilled at was the work itself. This is not an unusual configuration. Organizations are full of people who are excellent at managing the perception of their work and less excellent at the work. The gap between those two capabilities is usually managed by the people beneath them, the ones who do the analysis, build the methodology, write the sections that carry the thinking, while the manager above translates it upward with their name on the cover. I had been one of those people for Cressida for 2 years. Not by accident or naivety. I had understood the dynamic relatively quickly. Within 4 months of joining the firm and being assigned to her team, what I had underestimated was its scope. I had thought I was contributing to her work. It took me another 4 months to understand I was producing her work. All of it. And that she had been doing this with previous analysts before me and had developed, over 11 years, a sophisticated system for ensuring the production remained invisible. The system was not complicated. Did not need to be. Cressida scheduled all client meetings and senior presentations herself. She controlled which members of the team attended and which did not. I did not attend client meetings. I was told my role was research and analysis, the internal work that fed the external work that she presented. She reviewed everything I produced before it left the team. Not to improve it, she rarely changed the substance. She changed the formatting and the language in ways that made the work look more like hers in voice and presentation style. And she removed anything in the methodology documentation that was specific enough to raise questions she would not be able to answer. She sent all work to senior leadership under her signature. My name appeared in the team credits on internal documents, a practice common enough that it drew no attention and carried no implication about authorship. She was careful. I will give her that. What she had not planned for was me being equally careful. From month 5 I had been documenting. Not aggressively. Not with a specific plan for what I would do with the documentation. Simply because the compliance instinct I had brought from my previous role, the habit of maintaining records, of noting dates and versions and the chain of production, had not left me when I changed fields and had started doing what instincts do when they have no reason to stop. By the end of the 2nd year I had documentation of every major piece of work I had produced. Every version. Every date. Every email between Cressida and me where she had reviewed and approved analysis she then presented as her own. I had not used any of it. Until Darian scheduled the review. The quarterly review was routine. Callaway Research held them every 3 months. Senior leadership reviewed major projects with the teams responsible. It was an opportunity to assess quality, identify issues, discuss strategic direction. Cressida had managed every previous quarterly review with the skill of someone who has done it many times. She prepared briefing documents. She held pre-meetings with the team where she extracted enough summary understanding of the work to answer the predictable questions. She structured the presentations to move quickly through the technical detail and linger on the strategic conclusions, the parts she genuinely understood because they were the parts one had written to be accessible. This quarter was different for one reason. Darian had joined the firm 3 months earlier as the new VP of Research. He was not familiar with Cressida's style. He had not been present for the previous reviews. He did not know which questions to avoid or how to read the signals of a presentation that was moving quickly past technical detail for reasons other than efficiency. He asked the questions a genuinely curious senior leader asks when they want to understand the work. And the work was mine. So the questions were ones only I could answer. I had known Darian was joining the firm 2 months before he arrived. Not because I had been told officially. I found out through the informal network of junior researchers who always know these things before the official announcements. I had spent those 2 months thinking carefully about what his arrival meant. Not plotting. I want to be precise about that word because it implies a kind of calculation that was not quite what I was doing. What I was doing was assessing. Looking at the changed conditions of the environment and determining whether the documentation I had been maintaining had become something different from what it had been while I was simply building it. While Cressida controlled every access point to senior leadership, the documentation was insurance. Something that existed and that I hoped I would never need to use because using it meant a confrontation I was not certain I had the standing to win. With Darian arriving, that calculation changed. He was new. He had no established relationship with Cressida. He would be evaluating the team's work with fresh eyes and genuine curiosity, rather than the managed familiarity that the previous VP had settled into over years of Cressida's careful relationship management. Fresh eyes asking genuine questions about work I had produced. I did not arrange the quarterly review. I did not engineer the questions Darian asked. I simply stopped doing the one thing I had been doing for 2 years that had made the arrangement sustainable. I stopped briefing Cressida before the meeting. Our standard pre-meeting preparation involved a 2-hour session the day before every quarterly review. Cressida would go through the major projects with me, and I would explain the methodology and findings in enough detail that she could answer the predictable questions with sufficient confidence to satisfy the previous VP. 3 days before the Darian review, I told Cressida I was unwell and would not be able to do the preparation session. She rescheduled it for the following day. I was still unwell. She emailed me asking for written summaries. I sent summaries that were accurate and complete, but that did not contain the specific methodological detail that would allow someone to answer technical questions about the approach. The summaries I had always provided in client-facing documents rather than the internal documentation that actually explained the work. I was not lying. I was simply sending her the version of the information she had always presented to clients, the version without the depth. She did not know the difference because she had never needed to know the difference. She had always had me in the preparation session to fill in what the summaries lacked. On the morning of the review, she sent me a message asking if we could speak before the meeting. I was in a client call, I said. I would see her in the conference room. I sat in my office and waited for the meeting to begin. Darian opened the review with the project that had required the most significant methodological work over the previous quarter. A longitudinal analysis of consumer behavior patterns in 3 market segments that had taken me 11 weeks to build, and that had produced findings the client was using to restructure their entire product development pipeline. It was the most complex piece of work I had done in 2 years at the firm. Cressida introduced it with the practiced confidence of 11 years of introductions. She described the project scope. She described the client relationship. She described the findings at the level of strategic conclusion that she genuinely understood because she had read my executive summary. Then Darian asked his first question. He asked about the segmentation methodology. Specifically, the criteria used to distinguish between the 3 consumer segments at the point of data collection rather than at the point of analysis. Cressida said, "We applied a standard segmentation approach based on the client's existing taxonomy." Darian said, What was the client's existing taxonomy, and how did you adapt it for this project? A pause. Cressida said. The taxonomy was developed in consultation with the client over the initial project scoping period. Darian said. Can you walk me through the specific variables you used? The pause this time was longer. I looked at the table in front of me. By the fourth question, Cressida had stopped attempting specific answers and had moved to the deflection strategy of someone who is managing a situation they cannot answer their way out of. She referenced team collaboration. She said the methodology had been developed collectively. She said the specific technical details were best addressed by looking at the project documentation which she could send through after the meeting. Darian said, the documentation is helpful, but I find it more useful to discuss the thinking directly. Who on the team would be best placed to walk me through the methodology? Cressida said, we work collaboratively so. Darian looked down the table. He said, walk me through the secondary data approach. The room was quiet. I said, of course. And I did. For 23 minutes I walked Darian through the methodology I had spent 6 weeks developing. The segmentation criteria. The data collection approach. The specific decisions about the secondary dataset that had required 3 iterations before the approach was robust enough to produce findings the client could use. I answered every question he asked, with the specific fluency of someone who has been inside the work for 11 weeks rather than 11 minutes. Darian asked 9 questions. I answered all 9 without consulting a single document. If this story is hitting something real for you right now, hit subscribe. I post every Sunday and I do not want you to miss what comes next. The meeting ended at 4:37. Darian thanked the team. He said it had been a useful discussion. He said he would follow up individually with questions arising from the review. He looked at Cressida. He said, thank you for the introduction. I will be in touch. He looked at me. He said, I would like to schedule time to continue our conversation about the methodology. My assistant will send a calendar invite. He left. The room emptied around us. 2 junior researchers who had been present gathered their things and left with the careful speed of people who understood they had witnessed something and did not want to be present for what followed. Cressida and I were alone in the conference room. She did not look at me immediately. She gathered her papers. She closed her laptop. She performed the routine of ending a meeting with the methodical precision of someone who needs to do something with her hands. Then she looked at me. She said, that was not how we usually handle the review. I said, no, it was not. She said, we will need to discuss the team's communication approach going forward. I said, I think Darian will want to be part of that conversation. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she left. I sat in the conference room alone for a few minutes. Then I went back to my desk and sent Darian's assistant the project documentation file. The full version. With every version history and every date stamp and every email thread that showed the chain of production from my desk to Cressida's signature. Darian's assistant sent the calendar invite for Thursday at 10. I arrived 2 minutes early. Darian was already in his office. He stood when I came in, which I noted it was not the gesture of someone conducting a performance review. It was the gesture of someone conducting a conversation between equals. He said, thank you for the documentation you sent. I said, I thought it would be helpful context for our conversation. He said, it was more than helpful. He had read it thoroughly. I could tell from the questions he asked they moved through the file in sequence, referencing specific documents, specific dates, specific email threads. He asked me to explain the documentation. I did. Precisely and completely. Without editorializing or adding interpretation that I had not been asked for. I described what I had produced when I had produced it, and how it had moved from my desk to Cressida's presentations. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at me for a moment. He said, how long has this been the arrangement? I said, since approximately month 4 of my time at the firm. He said, and you documented it throughout. I said, I maintain records of all work I produce. It is a professional habit. He said, it is a very useful one in this context. I said, yes. He said, I want to ask you something directly. I said, ask. He said, what do you want from this conversation? I had thought about that question before Thursday. I had known it would be asked and I had wanted to be honest about the answer rather than performing an answer that sounded appropriately professional and was not quite true. I said, I want my work to carry my name. That is the fundamental thing. Not recognition for its own sake. I do not need the acknowledgement to understand what I have produced. But the arrangement that has existed for 2 years is not sustainable professionally, and it is not honest institutionally, and I believe this firm deserves to know what it actually has in its research team. He said. And Cressida? I said. That is the firm's decision to make. I am not here to make a case for a particular outcome. I am here to give you accurate information about what has been happening, and allow the people with the authority to address it to do so. He said. That is a very composed position. I said. I have had 2 years to arrive at it. He said. Did you consider raising this earlier? I said yes. And I decided not to because the conditions that would make raising it productive did not exist until now. He said, meaning? I said. Meaning that raising a concern about your manager's conduct requires access to someone senior enough to address it who is not that manager, and who does not have a pre-existing relationship with that manager that predisposes them to a particular interpretation. You are the first person in my 2 years here who meets both of those conditions. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, I appreciate your honesty. I said, I appreciate your questions. What happened at Callaway Research in the 6 weeks after Thursday took a shape I had anticipated in its general form but not in its specific speed. Darian was thorough. He conducted a review of Cressida's project portfolio going back further than my 2 years. A review that involved pulling documentation on previous projects, speaking with previous team members, mapping the production chain of major work over a 5-year period. What he found was not limited to my experience. I know this because he told me when he called me in for a second meeting 3 weeks after Thursday. He said the documentation I had provided had opened a review that had produced findings beyond the scope of our initial conversation. He said he was not at liberty to share the specifics, but that my account had been corroborated in ways that were significant for how the firm understood what had been happening. He said, I want to offer you something. I said, tell me. He said, there is a senior research lead position that has been unfilled for 4 months. The role requires exactly the capabilities you have demonstrated. I would like to offer it to you formally subject to the standard process. I said, I am interested. What is the process? He described it. An interview with 2 additional members of senior leadership. A technical assessment. A presentation of a recent project. I said, which project should I present? He said, the longitudinal consumer behavior analysis would be appropriate. I said, I will present the full methodology, including the secondary data approach. He said, I expected nothing less. The interview was on a Wednesday. I presented the longitudinal analysis for 40 minutes. I walked 2 members of senior leadership through the full methodology, the segmentation criteria, the data collection approach, the 11 weeks of development, the 3 iterations of the secondary data approach. They asked 14 questions. I answered all 14. At the end, the senior partner, a woman named Evie who had been at the firm for 20 years and who had the specific quality of asking questions that arrived exactly where the answer was, said, this is the finest piece of research methodology I have seen presented at this firm in the time I have been here. I said, thank you. She said, it has been sitting in our client reports for a year with someone else's name on the executive summary. I said, yes. She said, that ends today. She extended her hand. I shook it. I was offered the role that afternoon. The salary was 40% above what I had been earning. The title was Senior Research Lead. My name would be on every piece of work that left my team. I accepted on Thursday morning. Cressida left the firm in the 4th week. Not dramatically. Her departure was announced in the measured, professional language that organizations use when someone is leaving under circumstances that cannot be fully described in a company announcement. It thanked her for her 11 years of contribution and wished her well in her future endeavors. I received the announcement at my new desk, the one on a different floor with a window, with my name on the door and the small placard that the facilities team had installed on my first day in the new role. I read the announcement once. I felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sadness. The closest word I have for it is completion. The feeling of a loop that has been open for 2 years finally closing. I had not wanted her to be destroyed. I want to be clear about that. I had not built the documentation as a weapon or presented it to Darian as an act of vengeance. I had documented because documentation was what I did, and I had presented it because an honest answer to an honest question required it. What the firm had decided to do with the information was the firm's decision. I had made my decision much earlier. I had decided to stay. To keep doing the work to the standard the work required. To trust that the quality of what I produced would eventually encounter someone who could see it clearly. Darian had been that person. The rest had followed. I want to tell you about the first project I led under my own name. A new client. A pharmaceutical company looking for consumer insight research to inform their patient communication strategy. A project that required exactly the capabilities I had been developing for 2 years, and that would produce work I had complete authority over from conception to delivery. I briefed my team on a Monday morning. 3 researchers. All of them good. One of them, a young analyst named Femi who had been on Cressida's team before the restructure, had the same quality I recognized from my own early work. He noticed things other people missed and was not yet sure how valuable that was. I told him in the first week. I said, the thing you are doing with the segmentation criteria. The question you asked about the secondary source validation. Keep doing that. That is the work. He said, it is not what the brief specifies. I said, the brief specifies the outcome. How we get there is our decision. And the way you are thinking about it is better than what the brief imagined. He said, are you sure? I said, I have been producing this kind of work for 3 years. I am sure. He did it. The analysis he produced was the strongest piece of primary work the team generated on the project. I put his name on the methodology section, not buried in the credits. His name. On the section. The specific, visible attribution of work to the person who produced it. He looked at it when I sent the draft and came to my office. He said, you did not have to do that. I said, yes, I did. That is exactly what I had to do. Darian asked me 6 months into the new role what I had learned from the 2 years under Cressida. We were in a regular one-on-one that he held with senior team members monthly. He asked good questions and listened carefully, and I had come to value the meetings as the kind of professional conversation that produces genuine thinking rather than managed reporting. I said, I learned that documentation is not paranoia. It is professionalism. The habit of maintaining records of your work is not evidence of distrust of your environment. It is evidence of respect for the work. He said, what else? I said, I learned that the quality of work is not self-evident to everyone who encounters it. It requires someone in the right position with the right orientation to see it clearly. And that person is not always present. Sometimes you have to wait for them. He said. And if they never arrive? I said. Then the documentation is still there. And you take it somewhere else. He said, you would have left? I said, if you had not arrived or someone like you, I would have left at the end of that year with a comprehensive portfolio of documented work and found an environment where it would be seen. He said, I am glad you did not have to do that. I said, so am I. But I was ready to. He said, that readiness is what made the Thursday meeting what it was. I said, yes. I was not coming to you from desperation. I was coming from a prepared position. He said, the difference is everything. Evie called me into her office in the 8th month. She was not a woman who called you into her office for routine matters. She managed through the regular structures of the firm and reserved direct conversations for things that required directness. I went in with the appropriate attention. She said, I want to talk to you about the firm's research leadership structure. I said, I am listening. She said, we have been operating with a gap at the director level since Marcus retired 18 months ago. We have been filling the gap internally without formally addressing it. I believe we have been doing that partly because the visibility we had into what our research capability actually was had been obscured. I said yes. She said, what we saw in the Thursday meeting and in the subsequent review changed that visibility significantly. I said I believe so. She said, the director of research role requires someone who can lead the methodological development of the firm's work across all client engagements. Someone who has demonstrated both the capability to produce the work and the professional judgment to manage the team that produces it. She looked at me. She said, I would like to discuss whether that person is you. I sat with the question in the way I sat with significant things, honestly, without rushing to the answer that was convenient. Then I said, I believe it is. But I would like to understand the full scope of the role before I give you a definitive answer. She smiled. The specific smile of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. She said, that is exactly the right answer. I accepted the director of research role on a Friday. The same day of the week that things at Callaway Research had begun to change, the day Darian had arrived in the firm, the day I had decided to stop briefing Cressida before the quarterly review, the day the conversation with Darian's assistant had begun. I noted the Friday, not superstitiously, simply because patterns are interesting and sometimes the day of the week that carries your significant moments tells you something about the rhythm of your own life. My Fridays had always been the days when I did the work that moved things. The day I filed documentation. The day I made decisions. The day I was most completely myself professionally. I accepted the role at 2 in the afternoon and sent an email to my team at 3 to schedule a meeting for Monday morning. I wanted them to hear it from me directly and to hear from me what the role meant for the team's work. Not just the title change but the substantive change in how our work would be attributed, developed and presented. On Monday morning I told them that every piece of work produced by this team would carry the name of the person who produced it. That methodology sections would be attributed. That presentations would be made by the researchers who built the analysis. That the role of research director was not to present the team's thinking as their own but to ensure the team's thinking was good enough and visible enough to speak for itself. Femi looked at me from across the table. He said, is that how it is supposed to work? I said, it is how it works here now. I heard about Cressida once in the year after she left, through a professional contact who had encountered her at an industry event. The contact mentioned her name in passing, not to inform me specifically, simply as part of a broader conversation about the sector. She had joined a smaller firm, a boutique research consultancy that worked with clients in adjacent sectors to Callaway's. She was presenting herself as a senior research practitioner with extensive client relationship experience. I noted the information. I did not feel satisfaction or vindication. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a particular feeling at this point in this kind of story and I did not feel it. What I felt was the specific neutrality of someone who has resolved something and is no longer carrying it. The matter of Cressida and the 2 years was closed. Not because she had been punished adequately or because justice had been served in a form I could measure. Because the thing it had produced for me was finished being produced. The documentation. The Thursday meeting. The senior role. The director position. The team that now put their names on their work. All of that had come from 2 years that had been, in the moment, a form of harm. And the harm had produced something I would not trade. That was not a comfortable thing to say. It was true. My professional mentor, a woman named Dr. Callaway who had supervised my graduate research, and who I had maintained a relationship with through the years since, asked me in the second year of the director role what the experience had taught me about professional environments. I said, I learned that professional environments have a gap between what they say they value and what they actually reward. They say they value rigor and attribution and honest accounting of who produces what. They actually reward visibility and relationship management and the confident presentation of conclusions regardless of who built them. She said, and how do you navigate that gap? I said, by being the person who does both. By producing the work at the highest standard and being visible enough about the production that the gap cannot be sustained. She said, that is more work than one or the other. I said, yes. But it is the only approach that does not require you to compromise the work or to remain invisible about it. She said, "You sound as though you figured this out the hard way." I said, "I had a very thorough teacher." She said, "Cressida." I said, "Yes." She said, "Would you have developed this understanding without her?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Probably. Eventually." But the specificity of it, the precision, came from 2 years of watching a particular failure mode operate at close range. I understand it in detail now in a way I would not have understood from a distance. She said, "That is worth something." I said, "Yes. I have decided it is." Femi was promoted to senior analyst in the 3rd year of my directorship. I recommended him in writing to Evie and to Darian, and I made the recommendation with the specific detail and evidence that I brought to everything that required it. I described his work on 5 projects. I described the specific quality of his thinking, the noticing, the questioning, the willingness to push past the first version of an approach to find the more accurate one underneath. I described the methodology section he had written on the pharmaceutical project. I said it was the strongest primary methodology work I had seen from an analyst at his level in my time at the firm. Evie asked me, "You put his name on the section?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because it was his work. Attribution is not a favor. It is an accurate record." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You know why I am asking?" I said, "Yes. Because the person who was in my role before you knew me did not operate that way." She said, "No. She did not." I said, "I know. I worked for her for 2 years. Evie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have seen it sooner." I said, "You were not in a position to see it. The conditions that allowed you to see it did not exist until Darian arrived." She said, "That does not fully excuse it." I said, "No. But it explains it. And I have made my peace with the explanation." She approved the promotion. Femi came to my office when he heard. He said, "You recommended me." I said, "You earned it." He said, "You could have kept it for someone else. Someone more established." I said, "I could have. That is not how I run this team." He said, "I know. That is why I want to stay in it." The quarterly review in my 3rd year as director was a different room from the one 2 years earlier. Same conference table. Same building. Different people presenting different work in a different structure. The team presented their own projects. Each researcher walked through their own methodology. I introduced the team's work collectively and provided strategic context, but the technical detail came from the people who had built it. Darian asked questions. The team answered them. Every question found the person who could answer it because every person in the room had produced the work they were presenting. At the end, Darian said, "This is exactly what quarterly reviews should look like." He looked at me. He said, "Well built." I said, "It took a while to get here." He said, "The best things usually do." I sat at the end of the table and looked at the room. Femi on my left, fluent about the analysis he had spent 3 months building. 2 other researchers on my right, equally fluent about theirs. A team that had learned, under this structure, that their work was worth understanding deeply because they would be required to explain it themselves. They were all better researchers than they had been when I arrived. Not because I had taught them methodology, they had come with their own capabilities. Because they had been required to stand behind their work in rooms where standing behind it mattered. That was the thing Cressida had taken from the researchers who came before me. I was giving it back. I want to tell you about the documentation. Not the professional documentation I maintained from month 5 of my time under Cressida, though that matters and I will return to it. The personal documentation. The private accounting I kept in a notebook in the years of the arrangement. Not names or dates. Observations. The kind of notes a person makes when they are trying to understand something that resists easy understanding. I wrote about the specific feeling of watching your work presented under someone else's name. The particular quality of that, the way it is not like theft in the simple sense because the work still exists and you know you produced it. It is more like erasure. The work is visible and you are not. You occupy the same space as the work but are not attributed to it, and the result is a kind of professional invisibility that is the more disorienting because it is not total. People see you. They simply do not connect what they see to what they are reading. I wrote about what kept me going in the 2 years. The documentation. The quality of the work itself, the specific satisfaction of a methodology that works, of findings that hold up under scrutiny, of analysis that produces genuine insight. The work was its own argument, and I was committed to making that argument as strong as possible regardless of whose name appeared above it. I wrote about patience, about the difference between patience as passive waiting and patience as active maintaining, keeping the work at the highest standard, keeping the records, staying ready for the conditions to change. The conditions changed when Darian arrived. I had been ready. Evie retired in my 4th year as director. There was a dinner. The firm gathered in a way that firms gather for people who have shaped them over long periods, warmly, with the specific mixture of celebration and acknowledgement that comes from genuine respect. She gave a speech. She talked about the firm's research history. She talked about the work she was most proud of. She talked about the people who had produced it. She mentioned me. Not at the end. Not as an afterthought. In the middle of the speech, in the context of what she described as the most significant improvement in the firm's research quality during her tenure. She said, 4 years ago we made a hire that changed the standard of this team's work. Not immediately visibly, the work had been changing for longer than that, but the visibility of it changed. And the structure around it changed. And the team that produces it changed in confidence and capability, and in the specific courage that comes from knowing your work will carry your name. She looked at me across the room. She said, V. Ocombe built that. And I am proud that I was here to see it. I said nothing. I held her gaze and gave a small nod. It was enough. It was more than enough. People ask me sometimes what I would say to the analyst sitting at a desk in the 5th month of her first research role, building documentation of work that was leaving her hands under someone else's name. I would say, keep building the documentation. Not as evidence for a specific plan. You do not have a specific plan yet, and that is correct. As a professional habit. As evidence that the work exists and that you produced it. That evidence will outlast the arrangement. I would say, the quality of the work matters more than the attribution while the conditions do not exist for attribution to be visible. Pour everything into the quality, the methodology, the rigor, the willingness to iterate until the approach is as strong as it can be. Quality is the one thing that cannot be entirely taken from you even when the name on the cover is not yours. I would say, someone with the right orientation will eventually be in a position to see clearly. It may take months. It may take years. When they arrive, they will ask the questions that reveal the gap between the name on the cover and the person who produced the work. Be ready to answer those questions with the fluency of someone who has been inside the work every day. And I would say, when you have the team of your own, put their names on their work. Always. From the first project. Without being asked. That is not a small thing. It is the entire thing. My name is V. Ocombe. I produced my manager's work for 2 years. The VP asked her to explain it in detail. She could not answer a single question. Then he looked at me. I answered every one.